I remember the way my father would scream at my mother. His voice would boom through the two-bedroom house and echo to the outside where my siblings and I worked. There were days when he'd be too drunk to remember my mother's name or too mad to even be home. Not only that, he'd bring a woman home all the time. We were his workers, his children, only there to bring him food. But my mother never left him because she was too scared on how he'd react, and we were too poor to live on our own. There were days in which he'd go into town and spend our money on drinks that we'd be splitting 2 eggs for 8 people at home. Not only was our life miserable, but there was also a civil war going on outside our house. The soldiers would raid our house looking for food and shelter. They'd leave our house in a mess. Sometimes the guerrillas would come in as well, seeking for the same things. Amidst all this, our lives continued. I fell in love with my brother's brother-in-law, who I became an aunt to, a beautiful girl, and my older siblings created families. Throughout my childhood and teenage years, I held on to my faith and would go to church as often as possible, but the war made it hard. 6 out of 7 of us never got a proper education. I only went to school until the 6th grade. There were days in which we'd just cry of hunger or be frightened by the gunshots. My older sister left to the United States at age 16 when she realized that we had nothing left. I remember how broken I was at age 13 to see her go. We'd heard about the great opportunities in the US, but never considered it as an escape. My 2 younger sisters and brothers didn't live their adolescent years in the war, but they did live in poverty. All our efforts went in for our youngest brother to get an education. He's now a professor in Brazil. But one day, when there was no food left and the dresses I made weren't being sold, I realized that I could die that week. There was no money, no food, and much less any sign of my father. I was barely 21 years old, and my youngest sister 16, when we decided to follow our older sister to the United States. Crossing the Salvadoran border to Guatemala was easy, but once we reached Mexico, the real challenge came. We snuck around cities, hopped on trains. We sometimes just slept on the streets. In the desert, my sandals snapped, and I felt like there was no way of continuing. A man who was with my sister and me helped me up and urged me to continue because there was a bright future ahead of us. The way to the Rio Grande was one of the hardest things I'd done, and once we'd made it into Texas, we felt freedom. Making my way to the Houston area where my sister lived, she got us a job and helped us get settled, but it was difficult. We didn't have a visa, we didn't speak English, and we definitely did not have a car to get to places. My younger sister and I were stumped. We didn't know what to do. I remember hearing her recite the burger menu on the top bunk as we tried to sleep in the trailer we were living in. During the few months we lived there, my childhood crush reached out to me. He came to the United States 3 years before me. We talked a lot, and he wanted to be my boyfriend. So my sister and I decided to move to Massachusetts, where he lived, and we lived with our cousin. There was public transportation, a huge Latino community, and a place for me to stay in. Although the first apartment was hard to live in, I always had hope that I'd be able to prosper in this new place. But my immigration status was always an issue. After 10 years of dating, we got married. I moved in with him, and a few months later, I got pregnant. We had been told that I couldn't have kids because of my weak immune system. I suffered from arthritis and skin problems, that I was too weak to have kids. We were the happiest. 2 months before our daughter was born, we received a legal immigration status, TPS, which stands for Temporary Protected Status. We finally got better jobs and were able to get our licenses in a few months. Life was finally looking brighter for us. 5 years later, we had 3 daughters and bought our first house after being married for 7 years. Life was amazing for us. We had stable jobs, a car, a house, and a family. My sister had her own family as well. and got a condominium not far from where we lived. My parents became U.S. citizens and moved into my house. My father had stopped the drinking and came to his senses that what he's done to us was not right. A few years later, we had our fourth daughter. After 20 years of living in the United States, the government of the U.S. decided to take away our happiness. So many families were told that the parents would be sent back to El Salvador. Our daughters looked distraught, and we realized we had to keep our family together. Happiness and life had finally come for me, and now it was being taken away. I knew I had to fight. We have done rallies and protests and public speaking for our families. Our family won't stop fighting until justice is brought. And that's where I am today, fighting for my family to stay together.